Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you to the center and to the university for having me here today. I'm really delighted to be here, and all the events that are happening sound so amazing that I'm like, can I just stay here for like 3 months and attend to everything you're doing? This is, I think, a really, really exciting and fecund series of events, and I'm honored to be a part of it. Okay. Speaking of January 6th, while storming the steps of the US Capitol last year, an enthusiastic rioter exclaimed, "I'm here for freedom." This might seem odd, right? As freedom is often considered the highest political ideal in the United States. It's a righteous value that often refuses tyranny and coercion. The insurrection aimed to subjugate democratic institutions and force Americans to submit to a second Trump presidency that was not desired by a majority of voters. So freedom might see the wrong way for this guy to describe his participation in efforts to overturn the election, to enact violence, and to kind of trash the Capitol and harm people in the process. Right? There's arguably no higher value than freedom in American politics and political thought. It's often said to be the foundational value that the country embodies. And for historian Eric Foner, no idea, these are his words, no idea is more fundamental to Americans' sense of themselves as individuals and as a nation than freedom. According to the revolutionary claims in the Declaration of Independence, that liberty is an inalienable right. It cannot be taken and can never even be granted by others because it is so constitutive of what it means to be a person. Throughout US history, what people have meant by freedom has differed dramatically. It's included uncoerced action, non-domination, emancipation from slavery, full participation in governance, even individual responsibility, and revolutionary collective action to bring equality into being. Freedom is a notoriously contested concept. As political theorists know, it's also been in debate for over 2,500 years, and nobody has conclusively defined what freedom is and then convinced everybody else that they were right about it, right? Regardless of all of these contestations across its different uses, freedom typically signifies the highest of human aspirations and an unassailable value. So it would certainly seem easy to claim that our rioter, Nathan Enterkin, who was also wearing a Roman toga at certain parts of the day, that he in no way exercises freedom, right? But more is going on here. The rioter likely means the freedom to choose one's leaders if he believes, however erroneously, that his choice has been stolen from him. He also means the freedom of individual autonomy against state coercion, which is a pretty common definition of freedom in the US. Right? So while it might be easy to claim his actions in no way embody freedom, I think they might do something that's actually more complex. Right? For one, he draws on familiar definitions of freedom. But more importantly, I think he discloses an unsavory truth, which is that popular uses of freedom in the US have entailed not merely the celebrated practices of individual autonomy or collective participation, but they've also entailed subjugation and domination. Freedom is, I want to argue, both the highest ideal in American politics, but it's also the most brutal. And I think this legacy is both ambivalent and that it demands a full reckoning. And celebrated practices of freedom, like self-rule or full participation in governance or non-domination, are crucial for understanding what freedom makes possible. But large-scale systems of domination, like white supremacy, settler colonialism, and imperialism have all also unfolded in freedom's name. Right? Imperial control of other states is often claimed by its practitioners to be bringing freedom to unfree people. And white supremacy entails the sovereign freedom of a constructed race that imagines itself not only superior to others, but also having the capacity to enforce that hierarchy. Freedom's not obviously like the overarching drive behind things like imperialism or white supremacy, but it is capacious enough to be able to justify each one of them. And I think it's too reassuring for us to claim, right, that freedom is actually pure, and therefore that anytime freedom's used in this way, people are lying or they're dissimulating their relationship to freedom as a fig leaf to cover their true evil motives. right? Making that claim preserves freedom as an unequivocally righteous and hallowed ideal. But I think the problem is not that these unjust systems fail to support real freedom or that freedom is subverted by bad apples. The problem is that ideals of freedom can be produced as oppression, right? And legitimately practiced as subjugation. Throughout US history, freedom has certainly taken shape through individual liberty or emancipation from tyranny, but it's also taken shape as the right to exploit and the power to subjugate. Many practices of freedom do not end domination, but actually uphold it. I want to look at some examples from the start of the American experiment. Right? The revolution is perhaps the archetypal expression of political freedom in the US, where former colonial subjects liberated themselves from unjust monarchy in a radical act of political world making. Right? The founders brought a new democratic society into being, and they galvanized a form of free citizenship beyond individual rights to actually claim that freedom requires the shared making of politics. And yet, at the same time, their liberation was only possible because of their widespread land theft from indigenous peoples who lived on the land through which they declared independence. Violent and world-destroying acts of dispossession were practiced by the founders as freedom. It was their freedom to take that land in order to be free from monarchical rule. It was the freedom to cordon off native territory in order to exercise independence. And so much of, I'm sure, what will be explored in the question of indigenous sovereignty is how these legacies play out in the present moment, which they still do. The American Revolution also relied on and was funded in part by the enslaved labor of millions of Africans and their descendants. Slavery, which was legalized by US juridical processes, was interpreted by enslavers not only as the opposite of freedom, but also as a practice of freedom, as their freedom of self-rule for citizens who were white. It also was the freedom to buy and sell without government interference. And it was the freedom also to control other human beings in perpetuity. The system of slavery was thus not merely considered the opposite of freedom, but also a practice of freedom. It was the freedom of the master. Into the 20th century, men's claims for men's freedom permitted domestic violence against women. And in fact, a husband's prerogative in privacy was exercised through sometimes the assault and battery of his wife. One of the most popular legal scholars in the 19th century, James Kent, who's often considered the American Blackstone, he argued this on behalf of husbands, and this is his quote: "The law has given him, the husband, a reasonable superiority and control over the person of his wife. He may even put gentle restraints upon her liberty if her conduct be as such as to require it." So in other words, a married woman's liberty was at the discretion of her husband, and his freedom included his rightful capacity to constrain and control her. More recently, in the 20th century, racial segregation was justified through freedom. In George Wallace's infamous speech on segregation, the speech that launched his political aspirations, he named his state's refusal to integrate as, quote, "our fight for freedom." And he called segregation and white supremacy, quote, "the ideology of our free fathers." So throughout US history, the pursuit of freedom has clearly supported democratic revolution, slave emancipation, labor organizing, and social justice movements for gender, sexual, and racial equity, but it has also legitimated slavery, justified indigenous dispossession, and included sex and gender oppression, and even environmental destruction, such as things like "I am free to consume as many resources as I can pay for," or claims that environmental regulation is a form of unfreedom. And although I'm not going to talk about climate change as much in the talk, I do talk about it in my book, and I'm happy to talk about the links between climate and freedom in Q&A. So I call this dynamic ugly freedom, which are freedoms that enact or produce harm, brutality, and or oppression. To call freedom ugly is to emphasize how a celebrated value can be practiced as harm, right? It's not that harm is the unintentional effect of an action that we would call free, but that literally that free action itself entails harm. Ugliness as a political assessment tries to target how freedom supports subjugation rather than our typical imaginary of freedom as always an ideal. Ugliness names a disruptive experience, which is especially disruptive to one's expectations of beauty, symmetry, or order. This is how ugliness is conceived in aesthetics. And I want to deploy it politically to disrupt the exclusively positive way freedom is typically understood, to highlight the domination that is practiced in its name. We can also see influences of ugly freedom everywhere today. And I would actually submit that ugly freedom is increasing. Even since I wrote the book, we're seeing a proliferation of ugly freedoms everywhere. Across the country, there are new bills for education freedom that outlaw discussion of racism in classrooms. And it sounds like that's happening as well in Oklahoma, though I am not sure if the bills themselves are being justified as freedom, but they certainly are in places like Florida, my home state. Anti-abortion advocates sometimes argue that criminalizing abortion will actually grant women the freedom from having to make a burdensome choice. And actually the group that created a lot of the legislation like SB 8 in Texas is called the Alliance Defending Freedom. We also see new surges in book bans in schools that are often agitated for, on the one hand, claiming that book bans are in the service of parents' freedom, but also that they are created by a new group that has risen incredibly fast to national prominence called Moms for Liberty. And they understand their liberty is the liberty to ban books and to shield not only their children, but other children. And actually a lot of people in Moms for Liberty are not even moms, but to shield children from seeing books that they find are inappropriate. And oftentimes those books are specifically about sexual and gender diversity or the history of racism in the US. In the last 10 years, we can see certain ugly freedoms rising. We see this in Supreme Court cases that are around religious freedom. They define religious freedom in ways that not only expand the capacity to practice religion, but they do so in ways that allow religious freedom to override civil rights, to make religious freedom an exercise of employment discrimination, and to end disability protections. In Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, the Supreme Court argued that private corporations are free to deny healthcare coverage to their workers if their owners decide that the recommended healthcare goes against the owner's specific religious beliefs. So freedom here can sometimes mean the freedom to discriminate against workers and to take away their control over their own healthcare, especially regarding reproduction. 2 years earlier from this case in Hosanna Tabor, the Supreme Court ruled that any workplaces that are in religious houses of worship, like a daycare center in a religious place, that they are free to practice employee discrimination as a practice of religious freedom, right? So freedom in this case means the capacity to fire people who have disabilities without concerns for labor laws or fairness, and to make this a practice of religion. Another form of ugly freedom that we saw starting in 2020 was, as Sean mentioned briefly, part of movements for what is called health freedom, which asserted that vaccinating communities or wearing masks to protect the immunocompromised and vulnerable members of communities would limit people's individual freedom of choice. Right? Health freedom also relies on two really familiar freedoms. One, the principle of individual sovereignty, and two, the idea of limited government power over personal decision-making. And yet, the refusal, especially during the dark days of the pandemic and during its early moments when there were kind of laws about making sure you maintain social distance or wearing masks, right? All of these rules also made all other people around the health freedom practitioner much more vulnerable to a deadly disease and actively thwarted healthcare efforts to contain the virus. Anti-maskers often fantasized away the interconnections of health, which I think COVID showed us more than anything. And their individuated refusals to participate in containment strategies blocked large-scale measures to staunch the crisis. Freedom in health freedom meant to be free from responsibility to other human beings. And it meant to be free from the burden of other people's vulnerability, to be free even from recognizing one's own complicity in making other people more vulnerable. Perhaps this is why oftentimes health freedom practitioners did not call for a health freedom that demanded free healthcare or housing for all people or robust public resources to fund health, because all of these rely on a version of freedom that's grounded in a sense of shared interconnection, a sense of collective accountability to one another, and also a sense of bodily integrity that also stands in solidarity with people who are more vulnerable. These actions sometimes reveal the violent underpinnings of freedom, as these freedoms sacrificed public health efforts, disregarded the lives of the elderly and immunocompromised, and also even blocked the very concept that societal mitigation is something that should happen. Yet, I would also suggest that while ugly freedoms are gaining in popularity, we can also see active counter movements that are reclaiming freedom as a right for all. Right? In facing ugly freedoms, I think the goal is not to reject freedom as a value or to cede it to the kind of violent forces, but thinking about how do we claim freedom as a practice that does not exclude others, but that expands to include them, or a practice that doesn't harm others, but always works not to enact harm, or practice of freedom that is not about my own individual flourishing alone, but how can we increase the health and flourishing of all people? So I think some of these ways of reclaiming freedom advocate that the way they advocate Americans' abilities to both live a flourishing life and to have access to participation in public affairs. They fight against restrictions from those who want to hoard political power. So one of these ways of reclaiming freedom was the Freedom to Vote Act that came up for a vote, although it did not pass. It passed in the House, but not the Senate last year. The Freedom to Vote Act was just this type of freedom. The bill aimed to increase voting access across the country by, on the one hand, by blocking efforts to suppress minority votes, but also by making it easier for all Americans to vote, doing things like making, Election Day a holiday, allowing for same-day registration. The freedom here is intentional, right? I don't think it's just a throwaway term. It argues that the freedom includes everybody has to be able to have access to the power to shape governing systems, and that power has to be equalized. This means that freedom should entail collective governance, and that if you don't have a say in the conditions that govern your life, you're not free. The act did not pass. A more successful reclamation of freedom comes from the state legislation, and we can see it for one example in New Jersey, which signed into law a few months ago, or actually about half a year ago now, the Reproductive Freedom of Choice Act. This law ensures that women maintain control over childbearing and reproduction, a freedom we know that has been taken away as a national right. But it also, I think, intentionally uses freedom in a somewhat different way than this vote, because it says freedom is about individuals' ability to choose their own futures, to choose the capacity about whether their life should include childbearing or not, and not to force birth upon them. Efforts to counter ugly freedoms are not limited to legislative actions, however. They include the rising power of labor unions, especially when they endorse the freedom of association of workers and argue that freedom entails halting workplace hierarchy so they can also have a say in the employment power that governs their life. This also includes robust social movements that organize for Black, transgender, disability freedoms, as well as street politics that mobilize against the growing strength of fascism. Each of these movements might articulate a kind of different but aligned version of freedom, one in which freedom requires democracy, in that it requires other people, it requires inclusiveness. They often work to end discrimination and to try to enable all people to fulfill their own kind of desires for life. They also challenge structures of power that allow some Americans kind of undue access to power over others. I also love that the whole, exhibit here is called Pathways to Freedom. And I was thinking that alongside ways of challenging ugly forms of freedom with thinking about freedom as independence, interdependence, and access to power, right? A lot of these self-governing Black towns would certainly fit into that vision. And yet in all the things I just discussed, these are rather straightforward reclamations of freedom, right? We who study politics know where to find them, right? Legislation, social movements, halls of Congress. And in my book, I'm really interested in what I call actually a second and different type of ugly freedoms. So these are freedoms that work as a counterforce to some of the ugly freedoms noted above, freedoms that work, that are expressed as oppression or violence. So these are freedoms that counter those, but they themselves are not necessarily ideal or beautiful when we imagine what a utopian freedom might be. From the perspective of many kinds of modern theories of freedom, there are social and economic conditions that are deemed ugly or undesirable or unfree. These include things like dependence, where you're not free. You're not independent, but where you are dependent on others. These conditions also include things like obstructed agency, where you cannot get what you want, but your agency is limited in some way. And they also include things like moral debasement, where your behavior is not exemplary. You are not adhering to codes of propriety, right? Oftentimes, these three things are considered to be spaces of unfreedom, right? Immorality, dependence on others, or feelings of weakness. But I want to examine what is actually possible within these rejected conditions for cultivating somewhat unconventional, but oftentimes really generative and actually more accessible visions of what freedom can entail. Right? If most types of freedom reject reliance on others or abhor weakness, or they ban unprincipled behavior, I want to examine what unexpected freedoms might be found in these rejections. So I'm interested in freedoms that might be found in the middle of conditions that are deemed worthless, or they're deemed unvaluable because the people who are practicing them don't fit neatly into categories of exemplary citizenship, or because the freedoms might otherwise seem too weak or compromised, or sometimes even disturbing to kind of fit into the grand imaginary we have of freedom as always bold and always ideal. But I want to argue that some of these smaller and more minor freedoms actually can offer us more livable and less brutal visions for what freedom can entail. So I connect my first critique of certain forms of freedom as ugly with a second type of ugliness that I actually want to rehabilitate, which are practices of freedom that these forms would otherwise deny, obscure, or denigrate as ugly. In the book, I examined some of these freedoms in both their first and second valence through a series of engagements with film, art, political theory, with sugar, with TV, toxic substances, and other things, in part because I want us to be constantly expanding our vision of A, where does politics take place, B, what objects are considered political, and C, where we can actually exercise freedom. Perhaps, not always that it only has to be around the sites that are traditionally considered political. So I was going to go into a little bit two different thinkers that I use to think through some of these questions of ugly freedoms in their second type. One is the Jewish 18th century philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, and the second is the 21st century Black feminist theorist Saidiya Hartman, both of which I think ask us to imagine freedom being practiced in spaces that are disparaged by people who are often not necessarily granted by popular culture the capacity to practice freedom, but are actually practicing freedom all the time in spaces that are sometimes unjustly devalued. So I'm not going to go into that now, but there are touchstones for thinking this through in many different moments in history. So I use them to think about freedoms that are found perhaps in these smaller areas, freedoms that might be found in vulnerability or in discomfort, and ask us to think about how they might offer world-making freedoms for us that don't actually rely on brutality or subjugation for their power. And perhaps sometimes that's why they go unnoticed. So I'm interested in practices of freedom found in neglected spaces by people who might not otherwise be granted the grand descriptor of freedom. So I argue that freedom can sometimes be exercised through really boring things like bureaucratic sloth, right? Sometimes in certain conditions, freedom can be practiced in stealing, in meddling, or even something as seemingly inconsequential as an eye roll, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And I actually want to spend the rest of my time thinking through one aspect of ugly freedom in both capacities. One, in a sense of a freedom practices oppression, but also two, where I'll spend more of the time, freedom that might be found in a disparaged place or a place that seems so minor and unvaluable that it might not seem to offer freedom, which is the teacher's lounge. So, the freedom moment that I want to look at is a sigh of boredom in a teacher's lounge in a television show, right? Of course, not all moments in a teacher's lounge or sighs of boredom actually are practices of freedom. Most are not, right? But in the specific conditions that I examine, when teachers are asked to conform their teaching to neoliberal standardized metrics that undermine their learning, one teacher's sigh of annoyance leads to another's knowing eye roll. And pretty soon, these contagious affects of disaffection lead to a collective rejection that I'd like us to see as something small and minor, but still a practice of freedom. So I'll explore this briefly through the ugly freedoms of neoliberalism, which, right, is the term that we often use to describe some of the unequal conditions of predatory capitalism in our current moment. And oftentimes, many of the changes of this political economy are justified by freedom. I made a slide about neoliberalism, which, like, I don't know, what do you include in a slide on neoliberalism? But I guess this is what I chose for the moment, right? Oftentimes, neoliberalism entails the sense of finance capitalism taking over the power of states and often steamrolling over their capacity to regulate their own, finances and political systems. It includes skyrocketing rates of inequality because it also includes, the kind of deregulation of corporate profit making, while at the same time a defunding of social services. And the claim that in order to get some kind of freedom, all you need to do is be an individual entrepreneur rather than to, freedom comes from being an entrepreneur rather than being a citizen, we could say. The ideal of freedom is oftentimes an essential component of these changes, right? Where the claim is that deregulating business is a form of freedom. Removing social support removes forms of dependency, and therefore people are free when they don't have them anymore. And that also that public life should be defunded because anything that's funded publicly is a form of domination and unfreedom. Wendy Brown states that neoliberal practices entail, quote, wielding liberty claims like weapons, unquote. In other words, using freedom to dismantle social support and democratic practices that stand in the way of finance. Many of the scholars of neoliberalism emphasize its kind of global takeover. And yet I want to argue that despite its widespread damages, neoliberalism is actually significantly weaker than it often appears. When we see it from a top-down or global perspective, there's a lot of damage that is being done. But when we actually view from within the kind of smallness of local structures, there's much more kind of cracks and fissures and vulnerability. Many neoliberal policies don't have implementation power or they're susceptible to attack. But more importantly for my argument today, the worldview of freedom in neoliberalism, right? The freedom of a kind of radical individualism that suggests that you are not free if you, participate in public life, or that you're not free if you rely on any form of social support. And in fact, you have, that your freedom comes from being in a workplace where you need to be flexible and adaptable at all times. That this actual vision of freedom is fundamentally uncompelling to most people. So in order to look at this, I want us to turn to look at some of these smaller and undervalued, both the problems of neoliberalism, but more importantly, their rejection. I examined the acclaimed television serial show about life in Baltimore, The Wire. How many people have seen The Wire before? Just some. Okay, but great. The Wire was a watershed moment in the history of television. It's widely considered the best show in TUS history because of the way that it tracked the neoliberal transformation of a large city. And yet, contrary to its reception as a show that shows the unstoppability of neoliberalism, which is actually exactly what its director said was the intent of the show, I want to argue that The Wire actually shows various ways in which neoliberal norms are often obstructed. And they're not at the broadest level of inspiring or transnational power, but they're often blocked at the kind of lowest and most hyperlocal regions of power, the regions that are sometimes the most defunded and neglected. These promising challenges to neoliberalism in The Wire are generally overlooked because they're not revolutionary. They're not rousing. They're not individual heroic acts of someone making their mark in the world, right? Oftentimes they are small. They rely on other people. They sometimes happen in moments of weakness. but they actually instead showcase forms of freedom that might be easily overlooked, but are still viable and accessible. And I think when we don't pay attention to these small acts, we actually might sometimes feel that we are less free than we really are. So in The Wire, many institutions are certainly overtaken by neoliberalism, and many of them also by the kind of worldview of neoliberalism, where they judge their worth as public programs through how little money they can spend on them, or through quantitative metrics that only measure growth over time rather than actually measuring the services that they are providing to people. And yet, even when those institutions might be governed by neoliberalism, virtually none of the people working in them are, and they all try to work around it in sometimes in interesting ways and sleazy ways, and oftentimes in just kind of straight out exasperation. So take a look at a scene in the season that tracks the defunding of Baltimore's public schools. And it focuses on a middle school. The season tracks the neoliberal shift in education from teacher autonomy and qualitative metrics that assess learning in order to kind of a defunded workplace that is warehousing students with 30 or 40 kids in a classroom and measuring success solely by statistics that measure, performance on standardized testing, where teachers are punished, not even if they just show a straight line of performance, but if they're not growing, right, then they lose their money. So the school in the show has no money. And it forces teachers to take on all of the risk and responsibility of educating students themselves, even though the system itself is defunded and devalued. So in a 45-second clip that we're about to watch, it's a teachers' meeting that can easily be overlooked. Educators are sitting in rows as a speaker lectures them on what to do when they feel challenged by their job. They're not to ask for more support or resources. What they are supposed to do is repeat to themselves IALAC, which is an acronym that stands for I am lovable and capable. So the speaker is suggesting that teachers should self-invest by simply reminding themselves that they are valuable. And this will alleviate their job stress and, more importantly, help to raise their teachers' test scores. Okay, so there's one thing, so this scene is in two parts. It is intercut in the middle with a 15-second scene of a similar meeting among police officers. I'm not going to skip through it because it's too short to skip through, but so we'll just watch through and then get to the second half of the clip. So let's hope this works.
Only to the questions you ask or their comprehension of the lesson, but how they perceive you as an educator. And where does that begin? Out loud and enthusiastically. I-A-L-A-C. Let's go. Once again. I-A-L-A-C. And what are we telling ourselves?
I am lovable and capable.
Now I see those smiling faces.
Where the listing on the lower half of the page indicates some typical soft target locations, an officer alert to the terrorist threat must ask himself, do I know the location of my soft targets? Those where large numbers of civilians congregate. Train terminals, office buildings, stadiums.
Another hot zone in the classroom is the pencil sharpener, where children tend to congregate. And
I had a pencil sharpener in my class once. Antoine Grandison ripped it from the wall and threw it at me.
I'd like to know what your lesson plan suggests when Harold Houndshell sends a full set of textbooks through a closed window. Thank you.
Okay. The whole scene, it cuts off like 3 seconds earlier than I would have chosen because the whole room erupts in anger and frustration at that point. And the speaker's talk is over. Okay, so what's happening here, right? The allure of IALAC to the education system is that it will increase student performance with a super cheap investment, right? It presumes that with a few affirmative phrases, teachers will lift their own morale, right? Like literally their own bootstraps, right? Their own morale will be lifted up and the main goal will be achieved, which will eventually be improving students' test scores. The lecturer turns this bland phrase into an acronym in order to try to make its message even more efficient. But like it turns it into nonsense, right? IALAC means nothing, and it is even harder to remember than the phrase itself, right? So it's violating the efficiency it's deployed to engender. The scene lays bare the ineffectiveness of neoliberal norms that assume first that an acronym encouraging self-love is going to change the performance statistics of teachers who fundamentally lack the resources and support they need to do their job. And second, it challenges the belief that the burden for educating impoverished students in an underfunded school should fall squarely on the teacher's own self-investment. But more importantly for me, like the teachers don't buy it. Right? Very few of the teachers in that room find any meaning in this exercise to rebrand their teaching as the freedom to invest in their own lovability. And the reverse shots of the lecture are really important here because we see, right, the reverse shots kind of pan across the swath of bored, eye-rolling, even actively hostile teachers, and they're crucial to undoing the norms of IALAC. We see a couple teachers pay attention. We also know they're new. This is like their first day on the job. But everyone else is books. They're dozing. They're playing on their phones, right? They are passing notes like their own middle school students do to them, right? They are together performing disinterest. And their boredom is helping to establish a collective barrier between them and the speaker, a refusal to incorporate these new directives, right? The eye rolls are performative. Oftentimes, right, when you roll your eyes, you're kind of hoping to be seen, right? And often you're communicating a blatant disregard for the person that you're engaging with, right? You think of, like kids eye rolling at their parents, right? It's a performance of non-participation that is hoping to be seen and understood as such, right? It is a but profoundly communicated dearth of enthusiasm and an intended performance of inflexibility. Right? If neoliberal norms often kind of encourage workers to be enthusiastic and flexible in reaching performance metrics or shifting their jobs at any moment, then this scene shows precisely its opposite. The teachers' eye rolls and performances of disinterest reject IALAC, and they reject the cruel location of student success on their capacity to find themselves lovable. So in the end of this very short scene, something different starts to happen. The teachers begin to talk back to the speaker. They disrupt her presentation and they end it all together by pointing out the way in which it in no way correlates to their real jobs. Right after two teachers insist that these techniques for classroom management bear no relation to their experience, the whole room erupts in shouting. This eruption was unplanned and uncoordinated, but it's likely that it only happened because of the accumulated small acts of non-compliant disinterest and the way that the teachers began to feel in community from that, right? Their overt performances of rudeness and boredom connected the teachers and turned them into collaborative resistors together. This is certainly not a moment of a heroic act of freedom, but it is a clear rejection of this institutional imposition that is taking away their own autonomy in the classroom. Now, this doesn't mean that in their act of rejection, all of a sudden, magically, the school system has been funded, teaching's been transformed, the students get the wraparound services they need, right? This is not a beautiful moment, and it's not ideal. And this is part of why it is the second type of ugly freedom that I'm interested in. This is an act that seems small or minor. It might seem disappointing to us when we imagine that freedom is a much more grand act, right? It might even seem unworthy of the ideal of freedom. But I think it shows us the ways in which we have no problem tossing aside neoliberal rationality in favor of a form of self-worth and a form of collaborative connection with their teacher, with other teachers. They're not all best friends, right? And they're not all in unity in most other scenes. But here we see them finding alliances and connecting in order to preserve a sense of their autonomy in the classroom. And they do this in a way that shuns the desperation of IALAC and that form of self-investment. It might be small and unsatisfying, and it might seem, certainly not at the level of large-scale transformation, but it is an exercise of freedom. And I want us to see freedom from this view, because I think that means that so many more possibilities and practices of freedom are available to us in our everyday life when we dislodge some of our visions of freedom as only happening in spaces deemed explicitly political and only being deemed freedom in ways that must be ideal. So I want to end by saying, yes, that freedom can be oppressive and violent, and also that freedom can sometimes be challenged by other forms of freedom in larger acts or legislation, but other times freedom can look small, overlooked, sometimes unappealing, and even in other examples in my book, sometimes gross, right? But this is not to say that that we shouldn't count them as freedom. Right? I'm also not trying to say that freedom should not be grand acts and that we shouldn't have big imaginaries for what freedom can be, but that a sole focus on that leads out the many more ways in which freedom is actually more available to us in our daily lives in ways more accessible than we might otherwise imagine. They just are sometimes more minor, more neglected, and sometimes operating on a lower register or scale. I want us to find worth in actions that might be derided as unvaluable or even ugly without having to then recoup them back into standard definitions of ideal or beautiful freedom. So the phrase ugly freedom has a double meaning. In the first, it's trying to challenge understandings of freedom that freedom is always kind of unblemished and perfect, to show that freedom can entail acts of oppression. But in the second meaning, I want us to identify alternative practices of freedom that might be disparaged or rejected or considered undignified, yet that can still entail life-affirming actions that don't rely for their understandings of freedom on excluding or opposing others, that build from our social interdependence with one another rather than trying to dismantle it in claims that freedom only comes from independence from others. I want us to look at freedoms that do not require harm to enact their visions, and that help us to cultivate freedom as a practice of shared and equal world making to craft flourishing futures. We might erroneously presume that beauty gets us through the difficulties of the world, but perhaps instead it might sometimes be ugliness that gets us through. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes, I'm happy to take questions.
I'm very friendly to this. I mean, when I look at this clip from The Wire, yeah, it's disorderly and we might say like, ooh, it got ugly in there. But I think that's like a very beautiful, spontaneous display of solidarity. And so it's hard for me to look at that and see ugliness. I guess I'm just more interested in ugly freedom.
Thank you for that. I'm trying to like kind of move off the slide. Let's see.
Oh, I had a pencil sharpener in my closet.
What your window.
All right, we'll just leave it here. I mean, I am really glad that you see it that way, because part of what I'm interested in the book is transforming spaces and practices that might otherwise be deemed undignified or ugly or beneath or unworthy, and asking us to sit with them in order to find their worth, right? And that's part of what I think about through both Mendelssohn and Hartman, who are looking at practices on the one hand by Jewish people during the Enlightenment, on the other hand by Black queer women in the early 20th century, to try to say, right, both of these groups at the times in which they are practicing their actions are deemed as not having anything to offer freedom, that their actions are considered undignified or unprincipled or unworthy of freedom. And both of them are asking us to sit with these different practices in order to expand what we imagine might be possible, and to sit with the people or the places or the practices disparaged as ugly or unworthy in order to find that beauty. Right? Mendelssohn literally says to us, right, 300 years ago, that ugliness is basically, it's always a political assessment, right? What we claim to be ugly in society is often, we might make a claim aesthetically that it's just what I naturally find beautiful or not, but that it's always politically and socially conditioned by what's considered valuable or the status quo, and that ugliness is always being attached to the people who are excluded from that. And so for Mendelssohn, when you sit with those forms of exclusion, it loosens the hold of status quo beauty. So you start to find what is meaningful or valuable in other places as well, without then saying they should therefore be shoehorned back into those status quo beauties. So seeing something like this as a spontaneous act is beautiful, right? In its own way, without saying it's, I don't know, beautiful and like it's a heroic act of whatever, resistance, is exactly what I would argue too. So great, thanks for that. Yes,
I
please.
want to ask a kind of follow-up to that, and it goes to the intercut scene that you mentioned with the police here, because they form an interesting parallel, it seems to me. They too are being subjected to the same terrible training, and they're subjected to these same like performance metrics, like here's the crime map in the neighborhood, we're shifting resources, right? And often, therefore, we then see in the show incredible violence that comes from these sort of we're going to roll into this neighborhood and arrest everyone. And that seems to me a more complicated example here of ugly freedom. Like the cops resisted, but they're also like they don't have this kind of redemptive teacher like see them engage in acts of corruption and brutality.
Yeah.
So are the police in this sort of puzzle that show constructs overall, sort of embodying both aspects of this ugly freedom? Should we be suspicious of the cops rolling their eyes? Because they may roll their eyes, but they still go get in the cars and perpetrate these acts. So I just wonder why you focused on the teachers, I guess, rather.
This is a great question. I think one way I would argue is the teachers don't even get celebrated as potentially heroic actors in the show the way that the cops do, in part because one of the writers also is a former police officer and is drawing from his own experiences here. And I think part of what the show is trying to do is humanize police work in a particular way. And so I'll talk more about why that's more complex, where the teachers here are they're kind of dismissed and they're not really getting that sort of textured attention. In the show itself, on the one hand, we see, the show spends as much time with the networks of drug dealing as it does with police officers, because it's asking us also to humanize the people who are in this informal economy, right? And to understand what they're doing, especially in response to the police. And so there are moments when we can see this kind of ugly freedoms in some of the work that some of the dealers are doing in order to escape police surveillance, right? And especially when we see that kind of surveillance is only happening in the informal drug economy, when there's a huge amount of corruption and violence in the political economy of all the white collar elites in Baltimore that gets no political scrutiny. And in fact, anytime anybody even tries to touch it, they get fired, right? So there's a way in which there's a balancing that's happening. And I think that part of what David Simon and Ed Burns are asking us to do is they're asking us to, sometimes they might show a little bit of violence in what the police are doing, but of all the places where they are giving us a more sanitized view, it is actually of the police officers, because they never show, except for maybe 1 or 2, 3 instances throughout an entire 5 seasons, the kind of forms of police brutality that are much more regular than they're showing. So I think the intent of the show is to show the ways in which individual police officers are trying to battle a bureaucratic system when they often fail. And I think, that might not be what I personally want to get out of them, because I think, they are not necessarily being true to the work of the police overall in Baltimore. Another place where they're actually not really being true to Baltimore is the fact that there's actually a huge amount of community groups all the time that are actually getting involved in the governance and the social life of the city. So they focus a lot on the police officers and their struggle to do their jobs under difficult conditions. But, part of the show is always showing us individual actors who are doomed to fail. That's the intent of the show. That's what the authors say in all these different spaces. Teachers who are unable to educate their kids, police officers who are unable to actually hold criminals accountable. But they actually never show people really working together who are doing some of that work all the time. There's a lot of community group work in Baltimore, people that work outside of police systems for dealing with criminal activity, or people that are working to bolster the education system, or groups that are actually working to preserve the environment in Baltimore. And so by not showing us that and only showing individual people that are doomed to fail, I would argue that the show, on the one hand is both criticizing aspects of neoliberalism, but also taking it on. Because the show, right, I am reading this scene that we just saw as a collective solidarity, but I don't think the authors intended us to see it that way. They meant to see us as unruly teachers being chaotic. Right. And yet, the actual forms of real solidarity and community work that's happening in Baltimore, they also don't show, because the show doesn't seem to envision that power can really work in a community way. Right. It's individuals up against bureaucracies and neoliberalism. So that is a roundabout way of saying that I differ from what the show is trying to show in many ways. Number one, not only in the way they're trying to portray the police, but also in the way they're not showing the work of people who are collaborating all the time to create different networks of power in the city that I might read as ugly freedoms, but the show seems to erase from the Baltimore landscape, even when it's claiming to show fidelity to it. So great, thank you. Yes, please.
Two questions. Do you agree with this statement? Like my freedom to swing my fists ends at your nose? And secondly, do you think freedom has ever actualized that ideal where you're able to act freely without harming anybody else? Do you think that will ever come to pass?
Great. I do think there are people working all the time to imagine what freedom looks like without enacting harm. I think when we go to people who look at freedom as the kind of, what does it mean to help to create a world and to act in the world? I'm thinking of a scholar like Hannah Arendt, but we can also think, right, that's a form of freedom where freedom is about your acting in the world and working alongside other actors, other people in an equal space to act in the world. That to me is a form of freedom that is not necessarily about harm. Whether or not that's been enacted, right, that's also a different question. But the one thing about harm that is really interesting is that the philosopher who created that idea, the harm principle, that you can exercise freedom up until the point that you're going to harm another person and then you cannot, was John Stuart Mill. And he writes it in this very beautiful way that is canonical in the history of political thought, right? Which is, over his mind and body, the individual is sovereign. And that's everyone from, anti-maskers to people arguing for reproductive autonomy can draw on that analogy. And yet when we open this book, literally 5 lines after he argues this, he says, oh, wait, I didn't mean that this is actually for everybody. All the people who are living under despotic systems right now that are being colonized by the British, right? He's British. He's thinking of India and China, right? He's arguing they're not ready for this freedom yet. They need to be controlled by a dictator until they are disciplined into individual freedom. So all of a sudden, even when the harm principle is laid out in its most canonical form, 5 lines later, it is being used to justify really deep and violent forms of colonialism and empire over non-Europeans. So my question is always like, when did the harm principle ever, if even from the start, it was grounded in a claim that on the individual is sovereign. Oh, wait, I didn't mean all individuals. Let me be clear here, who does not count yet. You have to be disciplined into it, right? The harm principle was harmful from the start. Which is not to say, therefore, we should always justify harm, but it is to say, I think we need to think of freedom in different ways because, maybe that one has always just been too situated in its own unacknowledged violence to really be accepted as such. So I'm not sure if that's a precise answer, but it is, when we think about the history of that, it itself is quite violent. Yeah, thanks. Yes, please, Michael.
So I'm just wondering, something's always attractive about rebellion, even if it's just rolling eyes or, and of course it's hazardous because you really ought to know what the object of the rebellion is. So I'm wondering whether in the story you tell about The Wire, the movie, TV show itself, whether it's doing more work. Is it claims about freedom under constrained circumstances, so you have to act kind of passive aggressively as they're doing? Or is it the term neoliberalism? That is to say, you have to know that neoliberalism is bad before you can appreciate that gesture. Let me give you an example that in France, there's this very strange movement that went on for a year and a half where people marched on Paris from the countryside wearing these yellow jackets. Everybody who drives a car in France has to have a yellow jacket. Accident is just a requirement. They wear these yellow, they called the yellow jackets. They manned all of the roundabouts for months and months and months. They couldn't be bought off. It was actually it seems like, at some level, it's an expression of freedom. But of course, what they're initially objecting to was not neoliberalism, but the fact that the state raised the price of the gasoline in order to reduce expenditure on a fossil fuel. That is to say, it was a state-mandated environmental act that these people felt they were discriminated against because they lived in the countryside. They had to drive. Kind of a legitimate answer, it seems to me. They had to drive further to get to their place of business. But wouldn't you say wouldn't you say that that was also an expression of freedom?
Great. Those are, helpful and complicated questions, right? At least let me focus on thinking about that in terms of the wire, right? I do think, although I'm reading this in the context of neoliberalism, I agree with what I think is your claim that not everything that's happening in there is because of neoliberalism, right? And on the one hand, there might be some kind of not bad things or maybe unjustified things, just teachers being annoyed about other people coming in, right? Like you're at your work day, somebody's telling you a new thing and you don't have to learn a new thing again, and it's annoying. And I think that that's fair. And there are certainly times when we see that, and there's other ways to read, the kind of ways in which neoliberalism is shaping this space at the same time. Because one of the other ways that we see people shutting these new directives down for standardized metrics are that they just make up metrics. They call it juking the stats, right? So there's like different ways that people go about it. You're right, they're all passive aggressive in a sense. One is just literally juking the stats so that you can go back to the craft of teaching and the other one is just shutting down some of these directives. Neither of them are working to make the education system a better place, let's say, right? They're not, in part because these teachers are so underfunded and stretched thin that it's really hard for them, they're kind of too clear-eyed about their job conditions in a sense to imagine that all of a sudden here is this heroic freedom for the underdog and they also struggle in part because I think from their perspective, the forms of power that govern the school system are much more opaque than they used to be, right? Teachers had more autonomy, but so did principals over what they were governing and what was happening in the school. And as a lot of that autonomy erodes, and as power siphons upward, part of it due to neoliberalism, part of it due to bureaucratic centralization, right? There are various reasons for it. They don't even really know how to appeal or how to change things or who to turn to. Where's the money coming from? It used to come significantly more from local government. Now it comes significantly less. And and so all of those different layers make it harder for them. And so it's not only neoliberalism per se that does it, but I think at that point of contact, it's really helpful for us to think about part of what they are arguing for is a sense of autonomy over their classrooms, a sense of being able to judge as professionals what's the best way for them to educate their students, the students that they know and that they work with, and also trying to respect the other teachers that are in the room with them and to say that like, this is our craft and this is what we do and we can do it. And we see them learning from each other. It's not as if they're never learning or they're saying nobody can ever teach me anything. In all these informal moments or in peer, watching, they're learning from each other all the time. So I am not sure if that particularly answers the question of what exactly they're doing or fighting against. And it is more complicated in a certain way, but I also want to preserve it even in these different inflections for what they are doing and what, even if they are not articulating it, what I think that they are fighting for in that space.
Good. I mean, just a question. Before I quit, I just want to say, I was listening to your speech and I'm saying, your argument about ugly freedom really has legs, I think. I can see, finally, I can sort of talk to my cousin has 25 guns. He only needs one. That's a species of ugly freedom, I can tell. It's a great rhetorical device. Really I'm not at all surprised that you're being asked to speak all over the country.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. But I was also saying earlier in the day, a lot of people, when we talk about ugly freedoms, it ends up getting kind of personal or familial pretty quick because I think it allows people, even across the political spectrum, to kind of be able to think about like what they are frustrated by on the other side. And I think it even gives a language like, if we're always evaluating those freedoms and it's, how might my freedom be enacting harm or who is being excluded from this? How can we think about who gets to be included and why, or how are, what forms of discrimination are being enacted here, what forms of discrimination might be ended. It gives a language for having some of those conversations that otherwise seem to be at like breaking point.
It's a hostile, when my cousin and I talk, it's going to be a hostile talk. It's not a pacifying language.
No, it's not, and I don't think, serious talks about politics, right, often aren't, as as much as me. Yeah, great, thank you for that. Yes, please.
Yeah, to talk about the wire. So there was a moment where it looks like some newer teachers. They're kind of dressed nicer because they're trying to make a good impression for. Do you think that's also the possibility of the people that are saying, you know, I used to have a pencil sharpener and got thrown at me. This person threw a box of textbooks out of a window. Are they also doing a performative thing for the newer teachers to kind of say, don't be sucked in by this person coming in to talk that's trying to convince you, if you're not performing, that's your fault? Do you think that there's a performative view?
I've never thought about it that way, but I think that's really interesting. And in some sense, what that's doing is not only pushing against the speaker, but forming a kind of tenderness and connection to new teachers.
Community, maybe?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it in that way, but I really like that reading of it. You know, I have to go back into the series to see if those two teachers in particular, have any earlier, you know, interactions, if they are some of the teachers who are being tasked with watching some of the newer teachers. You know, then I think that could actually be like a really valid claim. You know, there are moments, we do see some older teachers who don't care at all about the younger teachers, in large part because they think they're going to be gone. They're like, these conditions are so difficult to work under, you're not going to be able to do it. But we also see other groups, you know, other teachers who are trying to take them under their wing and be like, let me show you how to survive, or these are the tricks you need to know. Don't assume things are going to be perfect the first day, and like, that's okay. And so we do see some of that happening, you know, in there as well, which would lend itself to that kind of reading. And might even deepen the sense of what's happening in that room. You know, one of the ways I think about it is like, if each of those teachers were asked to meet independently with the woman who's leading it, none of them would have resisted, right? You'd sit there and you might roll your eyes in your head, but you most likely are not rolling your eyes directly when you're in a one-on-one meeting. And you have no other collaborators. You don't have your teachers with you. You're not going to storm out, you know, you could like that, you know, you couldn't do that. And it only happens because they're in the room together, right? That allows them to have that sense of community that allows them to do this more spontaneous act of resistance there. So, you know, your reading aligns with that as well. Thanks. Great.
I don't want to derail the conversation. I know this isn't really aimed at like the initial prompt you asked, but your response to one of the previous questions was you don't think, or correct me if I'm wrong, you're not surprised if serious discussions of politics are not civil, right? But do you think that is a problem at all in our current like media landscape, where you see things like the news cycle is becoming more and more polarized, and you know, anything like that?
I think uncivil is different from violent and different from polarization. When you respond to somebody with a really different political view in an uncivil way, oftentimes it's because you're really angry, because it's something you deeply care about, are invested in, or it's the care of your community. And sometimes it's also, you know, in a bad way, it's because somebody's dislodging deeply held beliefs that you have and you're not sure how to respond, and that can be really scary. All of those, I think, are legitimate. It's really different than polarization per se, right? And it's also different from speech that is violence or that is justifying harm. So I would say, you know, when conversations get heated, like that's because you know, it's because you care, maybe because you're being threatened. But you know, that's different. I think having the expectation then, when we're talking about politics, and it's not only the politics that happens to other people, but it's our own politics. It's about our lives on the line, or people's own rights that are being granted or being taken away, or their lives that are being recognized or non-recognized, right? You can be really angry about it. Like there's no sense that you have to, you know, be calm in the face of feeling deep investments in fear about, you know, political differences. But I think that's different, I would say, than the kind of violent rhetoric, or claiming that, you know, somebody disagrees with you, you're going to kill them, or, you know, something like that.
I also agree that more vehement disagreement is much healthier than acts of violence or, voices raising violence or amplifying that. So I don't think we are, and I think the news cycle certainly exacerbates the violence we see. I'm not trying to discredit the acts of violence we have seen throughout, every year. But I think it's, we're much more in the camp of, I disagree with you rather than the purge,
Yeah. I also think back to one of Martin Luther King's early speeches called When Peace Becomes Obnoxious, right? And he's looking at efforts to integrate a college, and I cannot remember the name of the college, but all of the white people in the town got so angry that they started rioting. And so they stopped integrating the school because they said they had to keep the peace. And so he was saying, how can we sometimes think of peace or appeals to reason as actually forms of themselves of maintaining violence, right? And I think something like that is helpful in some of the ways in which we're thinking about it now.
You repeat the name of the speech?
It's called When Peace Becomes Obnoxious. Yeah. Yes, please.
What we're talking about, but I think you did mention libertarianism for a brief second. Is that really a philosophy, or is it just kind of anti-government? They say they believe in complete freedom, I guess.
I think what libertarianism is, on the one hand, has shifted a lot from its early moments to where it is now, where even early libertarians, like someone like Milton Friedman, would argue that he's kind of one of the early thinkers who influenced so many of the ways that people come to think about libertarianism now. He argued that the government is, usually a source of oppression. And in fact, anytime people get together collectively, that's usually a form of oppression, and that freedom comes from being an individual, taking individual responsibility from your life, and participating in the free market. But even he argued that sometimes he argued for universal basic income, for instance, because he believed that people shouldn't fall under a floor. And he even argued for things like sometimes you need government for things like climate change, because otherwise that would not induce people to act. Now, when you look at contemporary libertarianism, especially in the hard right, nobody would ever make either of those arguments. It's about you are on your own. You should certainly no kind of universal basic income for most, especially hard right libertarians. Never, climate change has to be addressed only at an individual level, or let businesses make their own choices. So it itself has changed a lot and actually gotten even more individualized and anti-government than it was at its outset. That being said, there's also new research that has actually showed a lot of the anti-government force of certain strands of libertarianism comes about at the same time that the state is requiring integration. So when you start to see the rise of libertarianism in Virginia, it's a lot of people who start to become anti-government and saying that the state is always a form of control and oppression, right at the moment that the federal government is mandating the end of segregation and the rise of integration. So it actually comes about in people working in schools saying that schools should have the right to choose who they want to, families have the right to choose who their kids go to school with. And so that's when they start disinvesting in public schools, arguing that public schools themselves are oppressive, they're teaching state doctrine, but it comes out of integration, so that also then gives a different slant to what some of that anti-government move is coming from. When you look back at things in the 1940s and 50s, a lot of people were really happy with government, right? Government was providing jobs, government was providing, there was the GI Bill, government was providing great home loans to people, the rise of public parks all around the country, and those things nobody had a problem with. People start to have a problem with it in the 60s once things start being desegregated and we start seeing parks opening up to everyone. That's when you start seeing places shutting down public parks, paving over their own public pools so that nobody can use them. And the claim that whatever the public is doing is going against the individual freedom to choose who you want to associate with. So, even when modern libertarians might disavow it, there's big chunks of libertarianism that arise out of that moment. Yeah, it's a complicated legacy. And I feel like as somebody studying this stuff, like I keep learning more and more historical scholarship starts to come out about the topic.
Like go back, rigid constitutionalists and say, Okay, we didn't have income tax in the 1800s. States could do whatever they want. Some of it goes back to that, I guess.
Yeah, and there is some of that. There's some of it in social Darwinism, right? The rise of the fittest, actually, in the 1850s, one of the kind of lodestars of contemporary libertarianism was in, a 19th century thinker named Herbert Spencer, which he wrote a whole piece called The Right to Ignore the State. It's literally like, if you don't like what the state's doing, you can ignore it. But he also then said you couldn't be a citizen anymore, and you have to realize that, right? You have to realize that you actually don't get any of the rights and benefits that come with citizenship. You have a right to ignore it by, dissociating from it, right? And that's different than saying I'm a citizen, I get to do everything I want and get all the benefits, but the state has to get out of the way, especially for other people because they don't deserve it. So yeah, thanks for that. I think these are live questions also. Yes, please.
Excluding the recent freedom that was taken away on reproductive rights, I remember growing up, I'm Generation X. I remember growing up thinking and kind of having it taught to me that all these other countries looked at America and they were jealous of all of our freedoms. Now, I don't think it's like that. Where do you see, where the road that we're on right now? I mean, excluding the one that was the recent one that was taken away, are we on the right track? I look at my grandfather, my grandparents, my folks, and they're very conservative and they want to hold on to those old ways. And then I look at the younger generation and I'm so proud of the younger generation now that's coming up behind me with the gay community, marrying who you want, the Black Lives Matter. Are we on the right track? Do you think we're going to continue down this road of improving ourselves?
I think that's the $1 million question right now. I mean, I think our society is really split in many ways. One of the things that Michael Mosher said in his class was that the Democrats are actually the more conservative party right now, by which he means conserving the values that have kind of that people want to hold on to as some kind of Americanness rather than a kind of really radical shift. So I think, thinking about like what is being conserved, what do we mean when we say there is an America that we want to live in? Like, what does that look like? Has that vision ever been something that's been universal for us or even from people, internationally? I mean, internationally, there has been I think we often told ourselves the story that America was a place that everybody looked to in the world. But I don't think that's necessarily the truth from, for a long time, because I think Americans' forms of, toppling other governments and controlling their finances, which were not on our radar in terms of the histories that were being told within the US, were very much on the radar of other places. And I know that there are scholars here who, study this and could talk more about it than I could. But, I also do think we're in a moment where I see people articulating forms of freedom that are so radically expansive and interesting and arguing for what does it mean to flourish in the world in ways that were inconceivable, 30 years ago, and trying to think about how do we do good to others? How do we respect other people's desires for who they want to be and how they want to engage in the world in really lovely ways that I find, to me, are some of the most expansive and exciting forms of what freedom can be that I've seen in my lifetime. I'm also Gen X. I also think we're seeing there's a huge rejection of that and a huge sense that all of these kinds of shifts of people trying to think about reckoning with our past, envisioning what's possible for our future, expanding freedom in ways, especially in terms of bodies and gender and sexuality, in ways that are really energizing, that seem deeply, deeply threatening to other people. And that is part of, I think, what we're seeing, a resurgence in ugly freedom. When we see all of the bills that we're looking at, almost universally, the bills themselves are trying to challenge claims about racial, gender, sexual diversity without making arguments that we can live in a space where everybody is treated equally or that everybody can be free, right? And so where are we going? Because the forces on both sides are strong, and there's that is the part that I can't answer. I think that's the $1 million question in politics right now. Where is the country going? Where are we going to be a place that's for freedom is more expansive? Are we going to be a place where it continues to narrow and only the people who've traditionally held on to it get to have it anymore? I I think it also has to be in the realm of narrative and storytelling. Sometimes people don't want to hear stories about how what they felt was a comfortable and safe space was, or a place where freedom flourished was actually a place where a lot of freedom didn't flourish. And how do we tell those stories and reckon with those differences in the past to do something different in the future? So part of it is, dislodging some of those stories about perfection in the past. Actually, just in my 24 hours in Tulsa, I'm like amazed at what this city is doing with its own ways of retelling its own history. Making those openings available, I think, can start to dislodge some of those deep attachments to storytelling about the past that is not actually accurate to what the country was. Once again, it's such a hard question, and I'm not sure that I answered it, but I talk about it all the time with everybody that I know, because I think that's like the question we're all wondering. Yeah, thanks for it. Yes, please. And then
kind of just tied into that, the thing that to me is I don't see a future very possible when you've got so many people wanting to shut down really history. Like, that's not allowed. Speak of it in the classroom. They're trying to shut that all down. And so to me, that's just very sad that truth is not important. Basically, that's really what we're talking about. Like, it's not like, oh, your version or this version. It's this is what it was. This is what happened. And that's not even something that can be ensured that people will learn. And that's very sad.
I agree with you. And I think there's a reason that so much of the terrain is on education. I think because the way in which we narrate the past is so important to the stories we tell about ourselves and about freedom and about the country. And I do think it's really terrifying, like when we think about my own home state, Florida, which is now claiming to ban AP African-American history. And, yeah, that's what I've been hearing from, right? And then at the same time, you think, well, when the AP exam was first started, every single story of history was lumped into one exam. And the story that was being told about African-Americans was quite minor and probably also not true to the richness and the complexity of the African-American experience. So the fact that there is now an AP in African-American history itself as a legitimate mode of scholarship for students to get college credit for any, high school student is also saying something, right? The reason that there's that pushback there is because there's actually been new stories that are gaining strength in the mainstream, and that becomes scary to people who want to tell a story where all of their own privilege is really just because they, it was deserved for them, and that they, got into their positions of power solely because of their own desert and not because other people were denied access to it. So I agree with that sense of fear, but I also think it's coming about because other really interesting and strong things are happening in US politics and education that are deemed threatening. Ron DeSantis can narrow history as much as he wants, but that history is still being told all the time. And in fact, there are 3 high school students today who are now suing him for it that I just said. So I also think of like, the people who are also growing up learning these stories and telling history in a different way are also really willing to challenge, their older generations who are trying to silence them because they're worried about the feelings of their students. When the students are like, we're not worried about the feelings, like we want to learn the history. I think there's both sides to it without saying this is an amazing moment and everything's wonderful. Yeah.
Xenia and Bruce both have questions.
Sorry, thanks.
All right, well, I'll go fast and you can take this as a comment instead of a question if you want. But as you were speaking about your examples of the second type of ugly freedom, which if I'm understanding correctly, you're tending to identify them in places where people are in positions of lesser power and institution, are already outside of the kind of status of power, access to resources or whatever, that these are forms of resistance against outsiderness or abjection or things like that. But what I keep thinking of is examples by which the first category of ugly freedom can be so effective because it can so easily appropriate that aesthetic of being victimized or so forth. And so enacting and in it sort of conveying the sense that you persecuted, disappearing middle-class white man, right, in the US, you too must find your ways to enact your little freedoms and resistances. And there are so many ways in which that seems to be appropriated as a structural position of sort of defending oneself and one's freedom, that it's interesting to think about the places of slippage or maybe appropriation of that second type of freedom into the dominant expressions of the first. So thinking about the insurrectionists and those who sort of, well, we have to do this because we're losing, right? Or we're being pushed to the outside, or our hold on power is being unduly taken from us. So it seems like it's something that's adopted and affectively activated to justify some of the first types of ugly freedom. So I don't know. I wonder if you're thinking about those places where they overlap, or where they sort of so much of the notions of the right right now are sort of appropriating their sense of what they think identity politics is, from other places, and using that to sort of bestow a sense of persecution and defending our freedoms from that structurally that same claim.
Yeah.
So anyway.
No, I mean, I think that's a great point. And I do think you see that. I mean, on the one hand, we don't actually see people here who are making claims about being victimized per se, right? The teachers are like, I'm enacting the power that I have and I'm going to do something with it, even if they're not articulating it that way. That's kind of what they're doing, right? But I do agree. I mean, that language of that I am the injured or persecuted person is really powerful. That's part of the reason that Ron DeSantis is, and anybody, right, is making claims that you can't teach whatever they imagine critical race theory to be, or African-American history, right? The claim is that the teaching of this is victimizing white students, right, who otherwise would feel bad about racial privilege. So, I do think there's ways in which we can see some of that happening. And in fact, I think it's really effective, because I think that's part of the way, somebody like Donald Trump gains power, right? As the most powerful person in the world, who also makes claims to be the most persecuted. I think Melania, said she was the most persecuted first lady in world history, something like that, So, just to comment on your comment, that I do think that you're right, that we do see some of that, and that it has become a powerful rhetorical tool. Even when in a lot of the ugly freedoms I'm looking at, oftentimes it's not the people themselves who are making claims about their own injury, but they are harnessing and wielding the power that they have available to them to do something with it that for them feels more expansive and is not necessarily at the expense of other people, which these claims of victimization are. Yes, please. And sorry, did you have a question?
No, I pass. I pass.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we're at 8:30, so I think we should probably bring that. We've tested you sternly here, and I'm grateful for your conversation with us throughout the evening, and for all of you for taking the time to come and to engage in such a lengthy and challenging conversation with our speakers. So thank you very much.
So many.
Let's go.
Yeah, I saw, what, I was like, it's been a long time. She was talking about it, and I was like, oh my God, that's perfect for us. So I.
Political pragmatism.
Exactly. So, yeah. It was this past summer, I think.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
On Twitter, I saw. I did with her, and I said, what we're doing this year. So she person knows her.
Because
That's yeah, this spring season is being. I have a heavy editorial in this.
I'm back here.
Yeah. Right, but it's also always a different ugliness. Okay. We can only handle ugly faces. We don't. Okay. I know we've got the not even 2-year-old yet. So happy hours are just our time of day. We got to get them home and bathe them and feed them and all that stuff.